I would rather tell people my son never got married than admit that he married a woman who sells grilled fish at the market.
Beatrice's voice rang through the crowded banquet hall like a sharp, icy blade. Within seconds, the entire room dissolved into amused chuckles. Some people turned to look at the woman standing in the corner with pity in their eyes, while others did not even bother to hide the contempt on their faces. Amara stood frozen, her hands clenched so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She could hear every laugh, every whisper floating around the room like needles piercing her dignity. The most painful part was not that strangers were mocking her. The most painful part was that Daniel, the man she had called her husband for so many years, sat there in silence without saying a single word. He lowered his head and stared at the glass in front of him, as if everything happening had nothing to do with him. And that silence hurt Amara's heart more than any insult ever could. Beatrice smirked when she saw that Amara remained silent. She raised her wine glass and continued in a mocking tone, "Do you know something? I used to dream that my son would marry a doctor, a lawyer, or at least a girl from a respectable family. But instead, he brought home a grilled fish seller, someone who spends all day standing in smoke and fish odors at the market." Laughter erupted again. Some people even shook their heads as if they felt sorry for Daniel. In their eyes, Amara was not a person. She was simply a mistake, a stain on the perfect picture that Beatrice had always tried to create for her family. No one in that room knew that the woman they were ridiculing had been waking up at 3 o'clock every morning for years. No one knew that she had stood in the rain under the scorching sun, skipped meals, and stayed awake through countless nights to help her husband's family survive their toughest times. They only saw her simple clothes. They only smelled the lingering charcoal smoke in her hair. And they concluded that she was inferior. But life has a very strange way of responding to people who judge others too quickly. 5 years after that night, no one was laughing anymore. No one dared to call Amara the shame of the family. The very woman who stood in front of that crowd mocking her would one day kneel before her with red, desperate eyes. It was Beatrice herself who would tremble as she held Amara's hand and say through tears, "Please, just this once, I'm begging you." But that was a story for many years later. At that moment, Amara was still just a poor woman selling grilled fish at the market, a woman looked down upon by the very family she loved most. They thought that because she was poor, she had no value. They thought that because she was lowly, she deserved to be treated with contempt. They thought that a woman who made a living selling grilled fish would never be able to hold her head high in front of them. Yet some secrets become even more shocking when they are finally revealed after being dismissed for so long. Some people are underestimated not because they are worthless, but because those around them have never been wise enough to see their true worth. And sometimes the very thing the world mocks today is the same thing God uses to lift a person higher than everyone who once looked down on them. This is the story of Amara, a woman who sold grilled fish at the market, a woman who was once called the shame of her husband's family, and the very person who would one day make everyone who laughed at her lower their heads and take a hard look at themselves. No one in that small market knew exactly when Amara had begun to grow up. Perhaps it was the day she stood silently before her father's freshly dug grave when she was only 13 years old. Or perhaps it was during the long nights she spent beside an old bed, listening to her mother cough herself into exhaustion inside their leaking house, while other children her age worried about school exams. Amara had already learned how to calculate whether the money she earned from selling fish that day would be enough to buy medicine for her mother. She left school early, not because she was lazy or lacked dreams. She left school because life gave her no other choice. Every morning before dawn had fully broken, Amara was already at the market, lighting the fire, preparing fish, and smiling at customers even as her hands burned from the hot charcoal. Life had never been kind to her, but she had never complained about it. She always believed that if she lived with kindness, worked hard, and remained sincere, then one day people would see her true worth. It was that belief that made her fall in love with Daniel. When Daniel entered her life, Amara truly thought that God had finally sent something good her way. Daniel was not wealthy, but during the early days of their relationship, he treated her gently. He said that he loved her honesty. He said that he did not care what other people thought. And for the first time in many years, Amara allowed herself to dream of having a home of her own. She believed that if she loved her husband's family with all her heart, they would love her in return. But Amara had overestimated human kindness and underestimated the power of pride. From the very first day she stepped into that house, she could feel Beatrice's scrutinizing gaze. Beatrice never hit her. She never openly insulted her in front of others. She did something worse. She made Amara understand that she was not welcome. In Beatrice's eyes, her son was worth more than every woman in town. She had always dreamed that Daniel would marry a wealthy, educated woman from a respected family, someone she could proudly talk about in front of her friends. Instead, he brought home a girl who sold fish at the market, a girl so poor that she could not continue her education. A girl who, in Beatrice's opinion, would forever disgrace the family. The insults began with the smallest things. Whenever Amara came home from selling fish, Beatrice would wrinkle her nose and say irritably, "The smell of fish on you makes me lose my appetite." Whenever guests came to the house, she would deliberately seat Amara at the far end of the table or send her to the kitchen to prepare more food. Whenever anyone asked about her daughter-in-law, she never mentioned Amara's hard work or kindness. She would simply smile faintly and say, "This is my daughter-in-law. She sells fish at the market." It was a simple sentence, yet every time she said it, the people around them looked at Amara differently, as though her profession was something shameful, as though all her sacrifices and efforts meant nothing. The most heartbreaking part was that Daniel saw everything. He heard every mocking remark. He knew his wife was hurting. He knew she often cried quietly in their room after family meals. But whenever Amara tried to share her feelings, he would simply sigh and say, "My mother is old, just let it go." At first, Amara convinced herself that he was only trying to keep the peace. But over time, she realized that Daniel's silence was not peacekeeping. It was a choice. He had chosen his own comfort instead of protecting the woman who always stood beside him. And as the days passed, Amara continued to endure everything. She continued trying to be a good daughter-in-law, never realizing that those quiet injustices were only the beginning of even greater pain waiting ahead. For years, Amara had never dreamed of luxury. She did not dream of mansions, expensive cars, or the wealthy lifestyles of the women she saw on television. Her dream was so small that many people would laugh if they heard it. She simply wanted a small shop of her own, a place where she would not have to set up a few plastic chairs on the side of the road. A place where she would not have to worry about rain putting out her charcoal stove or strong winds blowing away her shelter. That was why, for many years, Amara hardly bought anything for herself. Every coin she earned from selling grilled fish was carefully stored in a small box beneath her bed. There were days when she worked from before sunrise until the market was completely empty. There were days when her legs hurt so badly that she could barely stand, yet she kept going because she always carried hope in her heart. And finally, the day she had been waiting for arrived. After years of saving, Amara finally had enough money to rent her first storefront. It was only a small shop on an ordinary street, but to her it felt like a doorway to a new life. When she held the lease agreement in her hands, Amara cried. They were not tears of sadness, they were the tears of someone who had finally seen the reward for years of silent effort. On her way home, she could not stop imagining Daniel's reaction. She thought he would be happy. She thought that this time he would be proud of her. She thought that after all the ridicule and disrespect, her husband's family would finally see her differently. That evening, Amara placed the contract on the dining table and smiled at her husband. "Daniel, I did it. We're about to have our own shop." Her heart raced as she waited for his response. But before Daniel could say anything, Beatrice noticed the documents. She picked them up, skimmed through a few pages, and frowned. There was not the slightest trace of happiness in her eyes. Instead, she looked at Amara as though she had made a terrible mistake. A few minutes later, she called Daniel into a private room. Their conversation lasted nearly an hour. When Daniel came out, his entire expression had changed. He sat across from Amara and said coldly, "I think you should give that money to Grace so she can invest it." Amara froze. Grace was Daniel's sister. She constantly changed jobs and repeatedly failed in unrealistic get-rich-quick schemes. Amara thought she must have heard him wrong. She looked at her husband and asked, "That's all the money I've saved over many years. Why should I give it to someone else?" Before Daniel could answer, Beatrice spoke because Grace has more of a future than you do. And what about you? Even if you own 1 shop or 10 shops, you'll still be nothing more than a fish seller. The room fell silent, but what hurt Amara even more was that Daniel did not object. He sat there and silently agreed with his mother. For the first time after years of enduring everything, Amara spoke up. She tried to explain that this dream had cost her years of her youth. Countless sleepless nights and endless days of exhausting labor. But no one wanted to listen. Beatrice continued criticizing her. Grace cried and accused her sister-in-law of not caring about the family. Daniel looked at her with disappointment and said, "Do you only think about yourself?" In a single evening, the only person who had truly worked for the family's future was turned into the selfish one. In the end, under pressure from everyone around her, the money was taken away. Amara felt as though a part of her life had just been stolen, but the tragedy did not end there. Only a few months later, Grace's investment failed completely. The money was gone. Instead of taking responsibility, the family looked for someone to blame, and naturally, that person was Amara. Beatrice said that if Amara had willingly handed over the money from the beginning, things would have turned out differently. Grace claimed that her sister-in-law had brought bad luck into her life. Even Daniel began blaming her to them. Amara was always at fault, regardless of the truth. Then one fateful morning, while Amara was standing beside her charcoal stove at the market, Beatrice suddenly appeared. In front of dozens of people, she rushed forward and kicked over the stove filled with glowing coals. The freshly grilled fish fell onto the dusty ground. Hot charcoal scattered everywhere. The entire market fell silent. In panic, Amara dropped to her knees and desperately tried to pick up the fish. But Beatrice was not finished. She pointed directly at Amara and shouted for everyone to hear, "You will always be nothing more than a fish seller. Don't ever think you can become anything else." Those words echoed through the crowded marketplace like a sentence being passed. And for the first time after many years of enduring everything, Amara broke down in tears. Not because of the fish lying on the ground. Not because of the money she had lost, but because she had finally understood a painful truth. No matter how hard she tried, these people would never acknowledge her worth. It was in that very moment. As she looked at the fish covered in dust and listened to the whispers around her, that Amara made the biggest decision of her life. She would leave. That night, Amara did not cry again. After returning from the market, she sat quietly on the edge of the bed in the room that had once been called her home. She looked around at the familiar walls and realized that this place had never truly belonged to her. For years, she had tried to be a good wife, a good daughter-in-law, and a good woman. But in return, all she had received was contempt and increasingly cruel humiliation. When the clock struck midnight, Amara opened the old wardrobe, took out a few simple outfits and packed them into a small bag. The most valuable thing she carried with her was not money. It was her father's old notebook. A notebook that had followed her for years but had never been seriously opened. Before leaving that house, Amara looked at Daniel one last time. He remained seated in his chair. He did not ask where she was going. He did not try to stop her. He did not apologize for what had happened. That silence ended their marriage more completely than any divorce paper ever could. The first days after leaving were incredibly difficult. Amara rented a tiny room barely large enough for a single bed and an old wooden table. During the day, she sold fish. At night, she cleaned, organized, and counted every coin she earned just to survive. There were days when business was so slow that she had to eat dry bread to save money for rent. But at least, for the first time in years, no one was standing behind her telling her she was worthless. One afternoon, while lighting a fire beside her new stall, Amara unexpectedly ran into an old acquaintance from her former neighborhood. The woman looked her up and down before laughing. "I thought you left to do something great. In the end, you're still selling fish." Amara heard the comment but said nothing in the past. Words like those could have made her cry all night. But now she was too tired to care about people who judged others solely by appearances that evening while organizing her belongings. Amara accidentally opened her father's notebook. For the first time, she read every page slowly. Inside were not just ordinary notes. They contained special fish marinating recipes, passed down through generations and traditional smoking techniques that her father had spent his entire life perfecting. The more she read, the more she realized that the things she had always considered ordinary were actually incredibly valuable. A few weeks later, an older man stopped by her stall. He was the owner of a well-known restaurant chain in the region. After tasting a piece of fish, he remained silent for a long time before turning to Amara. "Who taught you how to make this?" Amara told him about her father. The man nodded gently and said, "In 30 years of this profession, I've never tasted a flavor like this." That chance encounter changed her life. Just a few months later, he signed his first contract with Amara. Her grilled fish quickly became a dish that people actively searched for. From a small stall, she opened her first shop. Then a second, then a third. Amara's name gradually began appearing on storefront scenes, in local newspapers, and on the lips of customers who stood in long lines just to buy a serving of her grilled fish. While her life was beginning to change, everything on the other side of the city was slowly falling apart for Daniel's family. Daniel lost his job after several rounds of layoffs. Grace continued throwing herself into unrealistic business ventures and eventually went bankrupt. Debt piled up higher and higher. One valuable possession after another was sold. The people who had once surrounded them while they had money gradually disappeared. Then one day, the bank sent a foreclosure notice for the house Beatrice had always been most proud of. Life may be slow when it rewards a good person, but it is equally patient when reclaiming what was built on arrogance. 5 years passed faster than anyone could have imagined. The small town where Amara had once been mocked remained the same. The old streets were still crowded with people. The market where she had once sold fish was still there, but Amara's life had changed completely. From a woman considered the shame of her husband's family, she had become the owner of a successful food brand distributed throughout the region. The name Amara appeared on large billboards, supermarket shelves, and in articles about successful entrepreneurs. But the most valuable thing was not the money or the fame. The most valuable thing was that, for the first time in her life, she no longer had to bow her head to anyone in order to earn respect. Meanwhile, somewhere else, the lives of the people who had once looked down on her were moving in the exact opposite direction. After losing his job, Daniel repeatedly failed to find stable employment. Grace sank deeper into debt. After a series of failed business ventures, the loans kept growing. Debt collectors called every day. Even the house that had once been Beatrice's greatest source of pride could no longer be saved. The bank sent its final notice. If the remaining balance was not paid within 30 days, the house would be seized. For the first time in her life, Beatrice understood what helplessness felt like. The woman who had always held her head high now found herself knocking on doors and asking acquaintances for loans. But the same people who had laughed and chatted with her when her family was prosperous all refused one after another. Only then did she think of the name she had spent years deliberately looking down on. Amara. That morning, Beatrice and Daniel arrived at the office building bearing the name Amara Foods. They stood in the lobby for a long time as if neither of them had the courage to step inside. Daniel looked far older than his actual age. Wrinkles now lined the face that had once been full of confidence. As for Beatrice, she no longer carried the arrogance she once had. Her worn clothing and tired eyes made her look like an entirely different person. When the receptionist asked whether they had an appointment, Beatrice lowered her head and quietly said that they wanted to see Amara. But Amara's schedule was fully booked. They were asked to wait 2 hours. then 3 hours, then 4. During that time, Beatrice sat out the office, staring blankly at the stream of people coming and going. And for the first time, she remembered the years when Amara had stood waiting outside her living room just to ask for a few minutes of conversation back then. She had deliberately made her wait for hours simply to prove who held the power in that house. Life sometimes comes full circle in the strangest ways. At last, the office door opened. Amara walked into the meeting room with a calm and composed presence. She was no longer the trembling, wounded woman she had once been. She was no longer the daughter-in-law who constantly tried to please everyone around her. Standing before them now was a woman who had learned how to stand firmly on her own 2 feet. After a few awkward exchanges of small talk, Beatrice finally revealed the real reason for their visit. She spoke about the debt, about the house that was about to be seized by the bank, and about her family's desperate situation. Then, with a trembling voice, she quietly said, "Amara, I need your help." The room fell silent. Amara did not answer immediately. She opened a drawer in her desk and took out an old notebook, yellowed with age. It was the very notebook she had carried with her on the night. She left that house. She placed it on the table and looked directly at Beatrice. "You always thought I was just a fish seller." Beatrice lowered her head, unable to meet her eyes. Amara continued calmly, "But you never knew that the recipes in this notebook have been preserved by my family for 3 generations." Daniel lifted his head. For the first time, he saw the notebook. Amara flipped through several worn pages before continuing. "The thing you threw onto the ground that day," she paused for a few seconds, "was the very foundation of everything I have today." The 2 people sitting across from her were speechless. They had always thought Amara's success was simply luck. They had believed she had merely happened to meet the right person at the right time. But now they finally understood that the very thing they had looked down upon most was actually the most valuable asset of all. The grilled fish they had mocked, the smell of charcoal smoke they had despised, the work they had always considered beneath them. All of it had become the foundation of an empire they could never have imagined. And for the first time in many years, Beatrice realized that she had not only lost a daughter-in-law, she had lost the one person who could truly have saved her family. The room fell into such heavy silence that even the ticking of the clock could be heard. Beatrice remained seated, her hands tightly clasped together, as though trying to hold on to the last piece of hope she had left. Daniel kept his head lowered, unable to look Amara in the eyes for years. They had grown accustomed to looking down on her. They had grown accustomed to her being the one who explained, apologized, and endured. But today everything had changed. They were no longer the ones with the power to decide. After listening to Beatrice's plea, Amara gently closed the old notebook and set it down on the desk. Her face was remarkably calm. There was no satisfaction, no triumph, no anger that many people in her position might have found impossible to suppress, because Amara understood something they had never understood. True success is not seeing the people who hurt you suffer. True success is no longer allowing those people to control your emotions. Beatrice took a deep breath and spoke through tears. "Amara, I know I was wrong. I know I treated you terribly. But that house is our family's home. If the bank takes it away, we'll have nothing left." Amara quietly looked at the woman sitting before her. There had once been a time when she desperately longed to hear an apology like this. There had been nights when she cried alone and wondered whether Beatrice would ever realize how deeply she had hurt her. But now that the moment had finally arrived, she did not feel victorious. She only felt peaceful, the kind of peace that comes when a person finally lets go of the past. She looked at Beatrice and gently said, "I can forgive what you did." Hope immediately appeared in Beatrice's eyes. But Amara continued, "But I will not save the choices that led you to treat people that way." The words were not loud, there was no bitterness in them, yet they silenced the entire room. For the first time, Beatrice was forced to face the consequences of the decisions she had made herself. For years, she had believed she had the right to judge other people. She had always thought status was more important than character. She had always believed that poor people should know their place, and now those very beliefs had brought her to this day. Suddenly, Daniel broke down in tears. These were not the tears of a man who had lost his job or his house. They were the tears of a man who had finally realized what he had lost. He covered his face with both hands and said through sobs, "I was wrong." Amara remained silent. Daniel took a deep breath. As though it required every bit of courage, he had to continue. "I was wrong for staying silent. I saw everything my mother did to you. I knew you were hurting. I knew you cried. But I didn't protect you. I thought that if I avoided conflict, everything would be fine. I thought you could endure it. I'm sorry at last." The words had been spoken far later than Amara had ever hoped. But life is often like that. Some apologies arrive after the wounds have already healed, and by then they no longer have the power to change anything. Amara looked at Daniel for a long moment before quietly nodding. Not because she wanted to return, not because she wanted to start over, but because she no longer wanted to carry resentment in her heart. A few minutes later, she stood up from her chair. The meeting was over. There was no miracle, no check was signed, no money was handed over. Amara did not save them, but she did not humiliate them either. She allowed them to keep the last bit of dignity they still had. When Beatrice and Daniel left the office, Amara did not stand to see them out. She did not call them back. She simply watched the door close and returned to the work she had been doing. A chapter of her life had finally come to an end. The next morning, as the sun began to rise, Amara arrived at the factory as she did every day, even though she now had hundreds of employees and dozens of stores. She still kept one habit from her poorest days. She personally prepared the first batch of fish every morning. The smoke slowly rose into the morning sunlight. The familiar aroma spread through the air. It was the very same scent that had once made people wrinkle their noses and look down on her. But now it had become the symbol of a brand loved by thousands of people. Amara stood quietly, watching the thin stream of smoke rise into the air and smiled. No one called her a fish seller with contempt anymore. And even if someone did, it no longer mattered. Because she had finally understood that a person's worth has never been determined by the job they do. People often judge others by the clothes they wear, the money they have, or the work they do. But time always has its own way of revealing the truth. Dignity is not about where you begin. Dignity is about how you rise after being looked down upon. It is about remaining kind even when you have every reason to become bitter. And sometimes the greatest victory is not taking revenge on the people who hurt you. It is moving forward without needing them anymore. If you were Amara, after everything that had happened, would you help the mother-in-law who once tried to destroy your life? Leave your answer in the comments below.